So, without further ado, I have the privilege to present the one and only Slim.
Hello, hello, hello? Yes? Okay. It was about 15 years ago. I had a friend who was suffering from depression. And as a close friend, I wanted to help because I cared. I started by reading books, magazines, articles, as many as I can. But they were mostly theoretical. So I went to a psychiatrist looking for some practical advice. And what the psychiatrist said is that the best I can do for my friend is learn to empathize with her. And I asked her, how do I do that? And she said, the next time she gets depressed, I should sit down with her and listen to her carefully. And if I can understand how she's feeling and why, I were to share that understanding back with her. And if that understanding is correct, she'll feel understood, and that would make her feel better. I was pleasantly surprised, because I felt like, oh, I could totally do that. But then I tried, and it was a lot more difficult than I thought. The whole time I was listening to her, she kept yelling, screaming, and bawling, telling me that I did not understand. So what was I supposed to do? I kept revising my explanation over and over and over again, hoping that I would eventually get through to her. But I couldn't. Nearly half an hour passed by, and I was just sitting there with all my energy drained, exhausted, unable to figure out what to do. But then something occurred to me. I suddenly remembered that earlier in the day, I had said something to her which in hindsight was hurtful. And so I wondered, oh, maybe she's feeling hurt because of what I had said. And so I told her that with an apology. And like magic, she stopped yelling, she stopped screaming as she sat there sobbing. I'd finally empathized with her. Now what I realize now is that everything I'd been telling her up to that point was framed in such a way that it was all her fault. And I had nothing to do with it. And this was not because I had malicious intent. I cared for her. I wanted to help. But all I was doing the whole time was making things worse by making her feel worse. So here's what I learned from that experience. We problem solve with good intentions like care. Sometimes this works well. Yet there are situations where the more we try to problem solve, the more we struggle and the worse the situation gets. Now the question we can ask is, why is this? Why is this so? Now let me analyze the story I just told to give you my explanation on this. So in the beginning of the story, I started off not empathizing with my friend. And that is to say that I was in a state where I was feeling as if I were disconnected or at odds with my friend. But then in the end, I did empathize with my friend. And that is to say that I was in a state where I was feeling as if I were connected or at one with my friend. Now here's the thing. The whole time, I wanted to empathize with her. The intention was there. But let's see what I actually did. First of all, I distanced myself to separate the problem solver from the problem, which was her or her depression. Why? Because my friend was the one that's supposed to have the problem, not I. How can the problem solver be a part of the problem? It can't. Doesn't make any sense. But of course, what did I learn in the end? I was, in fact, a part of the problem. I did influence the problem. My friend was feeling the way she was, not because of her depression, but because of something hurtful I had said. And yet the whole time, I was so fueled by a sense of responsibility of doing my job as a problem solver well, that I was blinded to the fact that I might actually be a part of the problem, or that I may be influencing the problem. I also elevated myself above her to the point where I considered myself to have the authority to judge. Why? Because I had spent months studying depression. Right? I even went to a psychiatrist for some advice. I may not have been the world's expert, but I was surely a better expert than she was. But once again, she was feeling the way she was not because of depression, but because of something hurtful I had said. Does that make me a good judge or a bad one? A bad one. So she was not wrong to reject my understanding. In fact, if anybody was wrong, it was me. I was wrong. And after elevating myself, I'd become so hung up and concerned with what's right, or judging what's right, wrong, good, and bad, that I was blinded to the fact that maybe I don't know enough to authoritatively judge. And finally, I strongly held on to the separation and judgment. Why? Because I was seeking conclusion and relief. It was painful and uncomfortable to see her feeling depressed. I wanted this to be over with as soon as possible. In fact, concluding this as soon as possible was so important to me that I went into the conversation prepared with a solution. And the solution was so simple. She just had to cheer up. Right? What a magically simple solution. If I can only convince her of that. But of course, in the end, not only did I realize that my solution was wrong, but that the real solution was completely new and unexpected. So all these were blinders that made it impossible for me to see the actual solution. Is it any wonder that I was struggling? What's ironic is that once again, my intention was to empathize with her. But as you can see from the two circles, what I actually did was make it more difficult for me to empathize with her. And not only that, but as I was distancing, elevating, and holding on to that distance and judgment, can you imagine what my friend must have felt? Separated and standing below me? My guess is that she felt isolated and disrespected. Is it any wonder that I was making the situation worse? I've come to call the collection of these three mind states as the problem solver's mindset. And I also call what we do when we have the problem solver's mindset, problem solving. Problem solving is great when it works. But when it doesn't, it can actually blind us to the actual solution, which only leads us to struggle and even make the situation worse. Now, some people think only men adopt this mindset. Who thinks this? Okay, good. This is a better crowd. So what I often say is that my mother does this too. My mother is so often fueled by a sense of responsibility to protect me that she becomes extremely concerned that something I'm doing is wrong or bad, and of course she knows what's right and good. And she wants to relieve the discomfort and pain of her concern immediately, to conclude what she perceives as a problem. Who else is a mother like that? Some of us? Great. So to be clear, this is not a criticism of mothers. It's not a criticism of anyone for that matter. Once again, we problem solve because we care. Okay? Sometimes this works well, yet there are situations where the more we try to problem solve, the more we struggle or make the situation worse. Who here is an employee of a company? Raise your hand if you're an employee of a company. Okay. So I coach CEOs, and most of the CEOs I coach think they are problem solvers, and their employees are problems to be solved. Right? They say the problem is employees who are disengaged, entitled, lacking ownership, underperforming, etc. Whatever the problem frame may be. Now, when I talk to the employees, guess what they think? They think the upper management is the problem. Right? The upper management doesn't listen, they don't invest in employees, whatever the problem may be. Right? In other words, we treat each other as problems to be solved. And with this mindset, does a problem actually get solved? Rarely. In fact, it often makes things worse. And yet we keep doing this even when we know it doesn't work. I think what's going on is that most of us feel stuck, just like how I felt stuck with my friend. We're doing our best, and yet we're struggling, and we hate the fact that we're making things worse. But without an alternative, we don't know what else to do. So, what I wish to do today is make it explicit that there is an alternative to problem solving. It's not an easy alternative, but we do have one. And the alternative is something I call realizing empathy. Realizing empathy is different for many reasons, but the one I'll highlight here is that it produces solutions not by trying to solve the problem, but through innovation. Now, what do I mean by that? To explain what I mean, let me tell you another story. So this was also around 15 years ago. It was a time I first got my leadership position at work. And there was a team member, let's call him Tom, who would often sit at meetings looking disengaged, disinterested, and very guarded. This went on for almost 3 months with no change. I was starting to get pissed off. Just could not understand the guy. Could not empathize with him. Now, what would you have done if you were in my situation? This is what I did. I told him, Tom, give me 30 minutes, and I'm going to meet with you one-on-one, and I'm going to sit down and listen. Not going to say a single word, not going to defend myself, no excuses, just complete silence on my part. You say whatever you want to say, and when you're done, you may stand up and leave. Not recommending it, I'm just saying that's what I did. So on the day of the meeting, he came into the room, and as soon as he sat down, he said, Slim, you're intimidating. And I was a bit taken aback. I was like, me? Intimidating? Why? I'm the nicest guy in the world. But of course I said I'm not going to say anything, so I shut up. I didn't say anything. I'll stay as promised. And he went on to explain. He said, Slim, you come so prepared to meetings that there's no room for team members to suggest their opinions. And every time we suggest something, you say, oh yeah, I thought of that, and it's not going to work. So people just agree with you now to get the meeting over with. But I refuse to agree with something I don't agree. You also project too much confidence. Whenever we voice our concerns, you just tell us not to worry. Do you think we can just stop worrying because you told us so? I have a lot of concerns about this project. And sometimes I'm not sure if you actually appreciate how difficult the project actually is. To be frank, sometimes I don't even know if you know what you're talking about. I was surprised. But I could empathize with that. I thought Tom had an attitude problem. But no, that wasn't it. He noticed that I didn't listen, so he shut up. When I learned what was really going on, it wasn't difficult for me to realize that I needed to change, that I had to listen more. And so the next meeting, I apologized for what I'd done, and I started to listen more. And right after the meeting, Tom came up to me and said, thanks for actually reflecting on my feedback. And I also thanked him for his honest feedback. Now, allow me to analyze this story to explain to you what I mean when I say that realizing empathy produces solutions not by trying to solve the problem, but through innovation. So first of all, what is empathy? I think many people have different definitions of empathy. I'm not saying mine is better than yours. I simply want to introduce mine so there's no misunderstanding. So to do that, let me start off by differentiating empathy from empathizing. So in the beginning of the story I told, I did not empathize with Tom. But in the end, I did empathize with him. Both of these are states of being. They're experiences we can have. Right? Now then, one can ask the following question. What made it possible for me to go from point A to point B? From experiencing not empathizing to experiencing empathizing. And the answer we can give is, well, empathy. Right? It's a simple answer to a rather complex question. Kind of like the word gravity. There was an apple up here, and the next moment it was down here. How do you explain that? Well, gravity. Right? Now, so empathy is a word we invented to explain what makes it possible for us to go from point A to point B. But empathy, unlike empathizing, is not an experience. It's a potential we have, or an ability we have, right? That makes it possible for this to happen. Now, with that in mind, there are actually two different ways in which we can travel from A to B. One way is to have our empathy realized involuntarily. Okay? This happens fast, it takes no effort, it's very easy. Okay? It's what happens when somebody says something that we agree with, that we resonate with. We empathize without any effort. But there's another way. And that is to deliberately realize our empathy. That's a choice we have to make. It takes effort. Sometimes a lot of effort. This can be difficult. Sometimes very difficult. For example, when someone says something we disagree with, our empathy does not realize involuntarily. The only way we could empathize with them in those situations is to deliberately realize our empathy. So to summarize, both not empathizing and empathizing are states of being. They're experiences we can have. And empathy, on the other hand, is a potential or an ability we have that lets us go from point A to point B. And realizing empathy is a journey we choose to go through from not empathizing to empathizing. Now then, which one describes what happened between Tom and I? Did my empathy realize involuntarily with Tom, or did I have to deliberately realize my empathy? I had to deliberately realize my empathy. I chose to go on a journey of realizing my empathy with Tom. But now you may be asking yourself, how does choosing to go on this journey yield innovation? Well, first of all, in my experience, innovation often requires a creative insight. Okay? And to be able to choose to go through the journey of realizing empathy, one has to shift their mindset away from a problem solver's mindset to yet another mindset. And this mindset is significantly more conducive to acquiring an insight than a problem solver's mindset. Now, what mindset might that be? Let me show you a video to illustrate this mindset. Watch this carefully. What did you see? Did you see a ball roll uphill? Yep. Okay. What did you think? There are usually two responses. One is, oh, I get it, that's magnets. Okay. Another type of response is, oh, how can that be? It's impossible. Okay. So if you said, oh, I get it, that's magnets, you, at least in that moment, adopted a problem solver's mindset. When we adopt a problem solver's mindset, we assume the problem is outside of us, that we have no relationship or influence on the problem. So it makes sense to think that the problem is over there, that there's a magnet over there. Okay? Now, with a problem solver's mindset, we also want to judge as quickly as we can. So the moment we think we have enough information, we judge. Oh, I figured it out. It's magnets, done. Right? And we tend to hold on to that judgment and separation. Now, on the other hand, if you said, whoa, how can that be? You, in that moment, adopted a paradox resolver's mindset. A paradox is a conflict between our expectation of how reality should be versus how reality actually is. Now, when we adopt the paradox resolver's mindset, we do not separate ourselves from the problem. In fact, we actively participate in the problem by saying things like, oh, what am I missing? Right? It's as if it's obvious that we are missing something, that we are part of the problem, that we may be influencing the problem in some way. Okay? We also feel ambivalent. We think, according to gravity, balls shouldn't be able to go uphill, but I'm seeing with my own eyes that it is, so I'm feeling conflicted. And this opens us up to let go, to learn. In my relationship to Tom, I decided to stop treating Tom as a problem. And instead, I decided to seek his feedback. Why? Because I ponder the possibility that I may have something to do with this. I participated in the problem by putting myself into it. But I still wasn't sure how I was involved, so I was ambivalent. Yet I was grounded enough to move forward despite the ambivalence. And finally, I let go of any preconceived notions or judgments in order to learn whatever I can from Tom. And so all of these conditions made it more likely that I was open to acquiring an insight. Now, are you ready for an insight for this thing? Take a look. Right. What did you see? Yeah. From a different perspective, it's not a hill. Right? An insight is basically a more holistic and nuanced understanding of the world. And to be able to understand the world in a more holistic and nuanced way, we need to be able to see it from a variety of perspectives. Right? To be able to see the world from a variety of perspectives is to see more details and facets of the world that we could not previously. And to see more facets and details of the world is to develop a more holistic and nuanced understanding of the world. The reason why I empathized with Tom was because his feedback helped me see the situation from a different perspective. That's what led me to an insight. Without such an insight, it's very difficult to empathize with someone whom you cannot yet empathize. To say this in reverse, realizing empathy with someone with whom you cannot or do not yet empathize can raise the probability of acquiring a creative insight. Now, when I acquired that insight from Tom, what also became clear is what I should do next. What I should do next was change my behavior. How? To listen more during meetings. And when I put that into practice, it was received by Tom as worthy of his gratitude. And not only that, he seemed surprised because he didn't really expect me to do anything about it. And to me, that's what innovation is, or at least the essence of innovation. Innovation is not just a complicated thing. Innovation is something so meaningful and valuable to someone that it inspires not only their surprise, but also their resonance or gratitude. Right? Innovative art, innovative products, innovative services, they're all the same. What I find over and over again is that an expression that arises out of an insight that comes from realizing our empathy has a greater probability of being received by that person as innovation. What I expressed in response to Tom was an innovation. Now, it may have been too small, may have been too micro to be called a big innovation, but it was an innovation to him nonetheless. And I also think large-scale innovation is nothing more than an emergent property of a bunch of small micro-innovations. Let's just think about it. To make large-scale innovation happen, do you think we need the cooperation of many people with different perspectives? I mean, at the very least, we need the cooperation of customers, right? How can we innovate without realizing empathy with the customers? Now, how about marketing? Sales, engineering, design, finance. I mean, when we have these large-scale projects, it's inevitable that we're going to run into situations when we cannot empathize with each other. And unless we can produce enough micro-innovations in all these relationships, I'm not sure that we can produce these large-scale innovations. So that's what I mean when I say that realizing empathy produces solutions not by solving the problem, but by innovating. If I kept trying to solve the problem, I would still be stuck trying to fix Tom's attitude. So now that I've given you an intro of what I mean when I say what I mean by realizing empathy, what I want to do in the remaining time is leave you with just 3 thoughts on what you could do to get started on realizing your empathy. First of all, I invite you to learn to make new meaning and value from your daily interactions. And what do I mean by that? So I've been working in the field of empathy and innovation for roughly 20 years now. I spent the first 10 years of that as a design consultant, helping Fortune 500 companies innovate. But then I spent the next 3 years researching how artists, fine artists, innovate differently from designers. And I didn't research by reading books or observing artists. I did it by making art myself. And to do that, I enrolled in an art school. So what I did there was I made art with wood, metal, clay, plastic, glass, among other materials. And I also went beyond visual art to venture into performing art through dancing and acting. So try to understand what are all these different ways in which artists innovate differently from designers. And among all these types of art, the one of my favorite was making furniture out of wood. Anyone used a saw before? Raise your hand if you use a saw. Ah, okay, so you may resonate with it. So this is a picture of the saw I used to make my furniture. And this is what it sounds like. No sound? Okay. So one day, I was trying to figure out how to saw. Let me play that one more time, in case you didn't hear it. Okay. So one day, I was trying to figure out how to saw in a clean and straight line. And it was not going very well. But after a few tries, a carpenter standing in the wood shop starts yelling at me. "Hey you, listen to the wood." And I was like, "What? The wood doesn't speak." So as I stood there kind of dumbfounded, he starts walking towards me and he says, "The wood is very honest. If you're willing to listen, it will speak to you." And once he comes near, he unclamps the wood I've been sawing, lowers it down, reclamps it, and says, "Do it again." And I do it again. And this is how the sound changed. Now once again, hear what it sounded like before. What difference do you notice? Yeah. But now here's the thing. I had heard that sound. But to borrow the carpenter's expression, I was not listening. Oops. Don't listen to that now. Turns out I'd clamped the wood too high. So every time I saw, it wobbled a bit. And that's why it was making a lot of rumbling noise. And it wasn't until I lowered it and made it more stable that I could actually saw it in a more clean and straight line. And this is what I mean by creating new value and meaning from our daily interactions. When I first heard the sound of sawing, I didn't find it meaningful or valuable. But the carpenter helped me create new meaning and value from it. Now, if we tried, we can make new meaning and value from just about any interaction we have with each other on a day-to-day basis. The question is, do we? We don't. So when we see or hear something, it's far easier to assume we know what it means or assume that it has no value. Just like how I treated the sound of sawing. And when we do that, it's a slippery slope back to problem solver's mindset, where we assume we know enough to judge. So if we wish to realize our empathy, if we wish to acquire insights, if we wish to innovate, I believe it's imperative that we learn to make new meaning and value from a day-to-day interaction with each other. The second thing I want to invite you to do is learn to regulate the tension you and others hold. So a few years ago, I was coaching a CEO of a startup who was engaged in co-founder conflict. The situation was like this. The company was in financial trouble. Everyone agreed to get outside investment, and the CEO had volunteered to get the investment. Then after about a month, they had an update meeting. And for roughly 2 hours, the CEO patiently shared the details of who he'd met, what they talked about, and what kind of potential lay in the relationship that he had formed. Now, what do you think the co-founders were thinking? There's only one thing. Did we get the money or not? Right? So after a while, one of the co-founders raised her hand and kind of asked, well, this is all great, but do you think we'll get the money? And the CEO froze. After a short pause, he said, have you been listening? And she said, oh, yeah. I'm just curious if we're going to get the money or not. And the CEO responded by saying, you're not listening. You're just sitting there waiting for the money to fall from the sky. And the whole room went silent. And eventually the CEO said, never mind, I'll figure it out. And just off he went, slamming the door. Now, what do you think the co-founders experienced here? The word I use to talk about this is tension. Right? And by tension, I mean a conflict between what our mind needs, expects, or values versus what we have instead. Now think of music with tension. When we hear music like this, you hear music? When we hear music with tension, what we need is a sense of resolution, right? And we value that ending. And we expect the song to end as soon as possible, or the sound to end as soon as possible. Yet if it doesn't end, what do we experience? Tension, right? So is tension comfortable or uncomfortable? Oh, that's the tension. Is tension comfortable or uncomfortable? Uncomfortable, right? In fact, after a certain threshold, it can actually even be painful. Right? So when we experience something that's just uncomfortable and painful, do we think that's a good thing or a bad thing? It's a bad thing, right? What do we tend to call something that's bad? It's a problem. What do we want to do when we have a problem? We want to solve it, right? And this is a very natural reaction. There's nothing wrong with this. This is probably biological. But what I learned from my conversation with the co-founders is that the source of their tension was that their mind needed a sense of security and clarity. Right? While they didn't expect the CEO to satisfy their need for security, they were hoping for some clarification. But what did they get instead? An expression of indignation and resentment. Right? So they felt even less secure and less clear. Their tension got worse. But now then, how do you think the CEO felt? What I know from being his coach is that he talks to 2 to 4 customers or investors a day. Now let's say he works 5 times a day, or 5 days a week, which he doesn't. He works 7 days a week. That means he talks to around 20 to 40 people a month. Right? Now, what kind of things do you think he hears from them? Turns out, very unpleasant things. Right? And from the investors in particular, he was constantly being rejected. In other words, by the time he came to the update meeting, he's been in a state of significant tension for a very, very long time. What do you think he needed? Yeah. It turns out he needed to feel appreciated. That's what he told me. The CEO told me that meeting with investors or customers felt like fighting in a war because he was getting hurt every day. Right? So when he finally returned home to his company to meet with his family, his co-founders, he subconsciously expected some kind of consolation or appreciation the difficulty that he was experiencing. But what did he hear instead? Where's the money? Right? Now, he probably felt very isolated and lonely in that moment. And yet for me, it really helped me understand my father better. Because my father was a salesman, and I'm willing to bet that he came back home every night with wounds all over his mind. wounds from customers, his bosses, whoever that may be. Yet all I ever said was, why do you come home so late? Why don't you spend more time with me? It never occurred to me to console him or appreciate him. I thought about only my discomfort and pain. When we experience tension, we become mired in discomfort and pain. When that happens, it's only natural that we want to problem solve, to want to conclude and relieve our discomfort and pain. This is natural. There's nothing inherently wrong with this. But think of times in our daily lives when this happens. It happens every day, so very often. Now, it's very hard to go against this grain, but to realize our empathy, we need to have room in our being to do so. And to have room in our being, we have to learn to regulate the tension both we and others hold before it gets all knotted up and even turn into a wound that's very difficult to heal. Otherwise, our organization becomes less and less likely to be able to realize our empathy, which means it's also less likely to be able to innovate. Last thing, I invite you to learn to manage your tendency to hyper-empathize. So one of the most prevalent phenomena I observe when I coach CEOs is the phenomena of hyper-empathizing. Now, what is that? Well, so far, I've spoken as if there are only two states, not empathizing and empathizing. But there's actually one more. That is hyper-empathizing. When we empathize, even while feeling connected or at one with someone or something, there's still a distinction. There's some boundary. But when we hyper-empathize, there is none. For example, many CEOs I coach hyper-empathize with their company. Now you may be saying, well, how can you empathize with a company? It's not a person. You're right, it's not a person. But we don't just empathize with people, it turns out. Who here empathize with plants? Yeah, some do. I have difficulty. Instead, I empathize with computers. This may sound weird to some people, but it's actually very common among programmers. So empathizing is a subjective experience, so it matters less who or what the other is. What matters more is how we feel and perceive them. Now, guess what happens when CEOs hyper-empathize with their companies? If they encounter anybody who threatens the company or who's perceived to threaten the company in any way, they become enemies. Because they're not just threatening the company, they're threatening them personally. That's the way it feels like. This can make trusting people very difficult when you own a company. Or when the company becomes financially unstable, they themselves feel unstable. So what happens when CEOs fail sometimes? Not always, but sometimes. Some of them commit suicide. They have lost their sense of self or self-worth. If we're not careful, hyper-empathizing can affect our very sense of who we are. And on that note, I'll tell you one last story before we end. So one of the things I often do with my clients is what I call collaborative journaling. It's where my clients write a journal every day and send it to me, so I respond to it. And with one client, I observed something very interesting, which is that after 3 months, it became very clear that his energy level drops to a 7 or a 6 when he's experiencing tension with customers, but it drops to a 1 or a 2 when he's experiencing tension with employees. So I mentioned this to him. And he said, oh, it's because my employees are so ungrateful. And he went on a monologue about complaining about employees. And so I stopped him. And I said, what emotion do you notice in yourself right now? And he said, disappointment, bitterness. But after a pause, he then said, shame. And I asked him carefully, whose voice do you hear right now? And he said, my Father's voice. What does he say? He says, you're going to do big things. What's the significance of him saying that? It means I'm not good enough. It turns out one of the reasons why he started up a company was because he wanted to feel recognized by his father. And he had graduated from a great university, he had a great job, but that was still not enough. He felt still he had to do something else to feel that recognition. So after starting up the company, he had heard a complaint from a customer complaining about an employee. And this was a big client because it cost more than 70% of the revenue. So this put him on high alert to get his employees to provide better service. But it wasn't happening fast enough. I got it. So objectively speaking, this was obviously not going to happen overnight. But because he thought that if his business fails, he will not be able to get recognition from his father, he could not help but hyper-empathize. And that's why he got drained so much from working with his employees. Let me skip ahead because I need to finish this. So let me say one last thing as I end. So I believe we live in a time where we're in a dire need for more empathy and innovation. Last year I gave a speech at a large healthcare conference, and what I heard there was doctors were busy trying to problem solve patients that they forgot to realize empathy with them. And this was making the patient's health worse. But what's interesting is then the hospital administrators turned around and said, the doctors are the problem. We got it. And they sent the doctors to empathy camp. And what they learned there was that doctors were burning out. They were so stressed. Now in the US, 7% of doctors are burning out and leaving the medical field every year. And to replace one doctor is $1 million. That's the situation we're in, where we're treating each other as problems to be solved. So what I urge you to do is that if you're a CEO of a company, I genuinely hope you're willing to seriously think of bringing empathy into your organization. Not because it's nice or morally right, because it's the way to get out of being stuck. And if you're not a CEO, I sincerely hope you're willing to start small by producing micro-innovations in your relationship to people around you. And please be patient. Please take this a step at a time. It may not happen that quickly, but if you don't start, it will never happen. I urge you. Thank you for listening.